Room 101. You've probably heard of it. It's the infamous torture chamber, spoilers by the way, invented for the novel 1984 by George Orwell, famous author, English author, real name Eric Arthur Blair, wrote under the pen name George Orwell, and he wrote the novel 1984 in 1949. And it was set in the year 1984, and it's not really a work of futurism in the sense that he's trying to predict the future. What he was trying to do with it was deliberately create a warning for the future, because in 1949, it was the wake of the Second World War. He had experienced life in war-torn Europe, post-war Europe, and life in the Great Depression in the UK and in Europe, and he had sampled life in the Soviet Union. So he was very aware of how societies can devolve and turn towards authoritarianism very easily in times of crisis. And he was also aware of how sophisticated big states were becoming. And of course, 1984 is the novel from where we get the phrase Big Brother, Big Brother's watching you, Room 101, of course, and terms like doublespeak, which is the kind of official language of the state in the novel 1984, which is basically the lies they tell by saying the opposite of everything they mean. So the state is run by these four ministries: the Ministry of Peace, which is actually starting wars and fighting wars all the time; the Ministry of Love, which is actually oppressing people and torturing them; the Ministry of Truth, which says nothing but falsehoods, according to the government's agenda. So that's the gist of the novel. And the main character in the novel is a man called Winston Smith, who commits the grave sin of thinking independently and falling in love, which he's not supposed to do, according to Big Brother. And these revolutionary thoughts get discovered, and the state arrest him and take him to the Ministry of Love, which is a building with no windows, always a good sign, and he is tortured, essentially, and he resists. The love that he has found in this other person inspires him to resist all the torture until they have done everything they can to torture him, and they say, but there's only one more thing we can do. Take him to Room 101. And the novel sets up Room 101 as this mysteriously terrifying place. I think there's one scene in the novel earlier on where a man is caught by the police and they say, take him to Room 101. And he collapses on the ground and says, don't take me to Room 101. I've got a wife and child. Take them and shoot them. I'll watch whilst you kill them. Just don't take me to Room 101. Yeah, so the question is, what is in Room 101? So again, spoilers. What is in Room 101? It is your worst fears. And in the case of Winston Smith, the main character, it's rats. So they get a cage with rats in and put it around his head. And there's this very small door stopping the rats, these hungry rats, from launching themselves at his face. And they threaten to release the rats to gnaw away at his face if he doesn't tell them what they want to know. And part of the point is that they don't really ask him any questions. He's constantly saying, what do you want to know? What do you want to know? And they just don't really ask a question. But eventually, what turns out is that in a very depressing end to the story, he submits and betrays his love, kind of swears obedience to the state, and becomes a brainwashed, fully obedient slave to the state. I think the implication of the novel is more about kind of information gathering, which is why I think it's endured so well, apart from the fact that it's very well written, is because I think the implication of the novel is that the government knows what the main character's worst fears are, despite the fact the character himself has never revealed it to anybody. So it's not that they're watching him so privately that he's said aloud, oh, I'm really afraid of rats. It's that they've observed him so closely throughout his life that they're able to say, rats, they're his worst fear.
Yeah.
And they're able to do that for everybody, whether it's being buried alive or dropped from a height, whatever. They're able to just calculate what people's worst fears are because they're so controlling and they've got so much information on everybody. And I think that's the real warning. I'm saying this. Many critics and many analysts and many sophisticated people have studied this book and have better opinions than I do, but I think that's kind of the core message of the book, which is if you give up total control to the state, who can manipulate you with words, the power of words, and controlling the media, essentially, they can gather enough information on you to control you to the extent that you will obey everything and repress yourself for the sake of survival.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at that time, yeah, I mean, it's when did he write this book, did you say? In the 1940s?
1949, yeah.
Well, I mean, I wonder where that inspiration possibly came from. in 1949.
Yeah, obviously, post-Nazis and in the Cold War and the Soviet Union, we knew what they were doing. All those famous photographs of Stalin standing next to empty space. Was there a person there originally?
Yeah.
Oh, yep, they were painted out because they were disappeared.
Yes.
And I think for me, well, firstly, we know no one's entirely sure, but they have some ideas because George Orwell did work for a brief time in the BBC as a correspondent, and he hated it. He hated working for the BBC. He absolutely hated it. And apparently, one thing that he particularly despised was the endless meetings they would have in Office 101 in the building,
nice.
in Broadcasting House. So he hated these meetings so much, he thought of them as torturous, so he named the room in his novel in honor of that. But apparently the physical description he gives of the building, the Ministry of Love, is uncannily similar to the headmaster's study in his old school that he went to as a child. So it's kind of says more about him than it does about his vision of society to a certain extent, doesn't it?
Well, it is. I guess Room 101 in the novel is so personal to each individual, isn't it? So it makes sense to kind of to build it upon all of it upon personal experience as well. I'd say that I mean, when we're looking at 1984 and the Big Brother state today, I think there's definitely a question mark about whether it is these traditional actors, it is the traditional government actors who are the ones controlling, or whether it's morphed into third parties and private organizations and private companies as opposed to the government who are actually gathering all this information and who are the dangers to the world. I mean, there's definitely there's the overarching organization of government in 1984. Whereas actually, it feels like it's a little bit more devolved in reality. Like you have certain state actors now, like the Chinese government, who very much take that role in China. But then globally, and especially in the West and the US, you have like the Secret Service, and you have the Snowden revelations and stuff, and and security forces are spying you. But then you also have the integrations with social media, big social media companies who are gathering huge amounts of data, and basically you are the commodity of social media platforms. Your data is what's being sold. You are being sold.
Yeah.
And so I think it's maybe a little bit even more nuanced than George Orwell could have ever imagined, with the way in which the world has advanced. So I think that's quite an interesting one, that if he was able to rewrite it, well, not rewrite it, but if he was able to have a bit of a review of what was written today, and you asked him, okay, if you were to rewrite it today, what changes would you make? I wonder if he would include other actors as well as just the overarching government.
True.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, we always joke like, our phones are listening to us because they've just recommended something that we swear we never even mentioned to anyone. And the sinister truth is, like, the algorithms just know your demographic and they know so much information about you. They didn't need to know that you wanted that specific thing, because you just fit that demographic profile so perfectly. They're able to predict exactly what you want, or what you might be interested in, so accurately. So yeah, I mean, it's not even that they need to listen to you. It's just that they know so much. They've collected so much data on you. And it's hard to not see the parallels between that and this, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Yeah, both of you you're completely right. It is exactly what the society that I think George Orwell is describing in the novel. Being able to construct a person just from the information you have about what they do on a daily basis. And you can understand their mind in a way that psychologists are probably very envious of. But also we've seen recently, as you suggested, Martin, like the Cambridge Analytica thing with Facebook, illegally selling all that data to the firm Cambridge Analytica to use it in a political campaign in 2016 in the UK, to target people who didn't even support Brexit, which is Britain leaving the European Union, but who were inclined to be susceptible to the influence of the arguments of the Brexit campaign. And it succeeded. And the people who won have been in power in government in the 6 years since then. So they're not going to do anything about it. And again, that's kind of just like in a novel, where as long as the winners are in charge, they'll do whatever they like. It's an oligarchy. And I think in the book, it explicitly is an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a society ruled by a group of individuals, rather than a democracy, which is, in theory, rarely in practice, but in theory, ruled by the people at large, society as a whole. And an oligarchy doesn't have to be politicians. It can be the wealthy, just famous people, anybody who has some kind of prominence and influence for whatever reason, usually fame, political status, or wealth, and sometimes all three. And I think that's another thing. It's such an influential concept, and he popularized it and made people so aware of it that we use the term that he created for the book, which is doublespeak, which is people lying, but specifically saying the opposite of what is true in order to hide the truth, just to confuse people and ultimately to control people. You're saying what sounds good, but is literally untrue. And there's, I discovered that there is an annual doublespeak award.
Nice.
Yeah, since the 1970s, I think, given to prominent people who performed particularly erroneous examples of doublespeak, such as the winner in 2017 was Kellyanne Conway for coining the term alternative facts.
Oh, yeah.
That's a fantastic, that's probably the best example of doublespeak in the real world.
Alternative facts. Now, you don't like these facts? I've got some more for you.
Yeah. In 2006, they awarded it to George W. Bush, who gave a speech saying he was against poverty and income inequality just after he signed an executive order to allow contractors to employ people below the minimum wage. The tobacco industry as a whole won it in the year 2000 for funding charitable efforts to support children, domestic abuse victims, and disaster victims, whilst at the same time, obviously, causing cancer.
And marketing it to kids.
Yes.
What about oil conglomerates? Surely that they've got to have won it at some point, pushing carbon footprints and stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of
blaming,
shifting the blame onto people.
Well, yeah, creating the phrase carbon footprints. Yeah, 2012, Alex, the American Petroleum Institute.
I called it.
I mean, lots of these actors could win it every year, couldn't they? In their own right.
Yeah, I feel like the shortlist every year must be quite hard to vary. How do you make this better? Yeah. I mean, because we've come up with different terms since then, haven't we? Like greenwashing is, I think, the new trend for companies. Definitely a big thing happening now. Lots of companies saying, look, all these things we're doing to help the environment, whilst we're destroying the rainforests to create our products.
A huge one this year has been sports washing with the Saudi government fund that they're using to buy up huge sporting events and therefore make the government seem acceptable on the world stage. They bought up the Live Golf Tour, and they bought Newcastle United, and they're bidding on Liverpool and Manchester United.
Bloody hell. But that's kind of similar to the controversies when people say, why are you giving Beijing the Olympics? Why are you giving Moscow the Olympics?
Why are you giving Qatar
the World Cup, yeah. But did Russia just host the World Cup, or has it got the next World Cup?
They hosted it in 2018.
Right, so you had the double whammy of Moscow.
2014.
Moscow.
They won it. Yeah. They won it on the same day, so they announced them at the same time. So it's like Russia and then Qatar.
And there was a FIFA executive that was quoted as saying they prefer giving the World Cup to authoritarian countries because they tend to run a bit smoother, or it's just easier or something. Just mad.
Less fighting between fans, right? So you know that if you fight and get arrested, you're going to be in a gulag for 15 years.
Yeah, so those are the origins of Room 101. And of course, the sad relevance of the whole book and Room 101 to the society that we still live in. Yeah, and what's ironic is that everybody knows about this book. It's famous. Like, everybody knows. Even someone walking down the street, they might think of the TV show when you say, have you heard of Big Brother? They'll say the TV show first. But everyone knows what it means. It means Big Brother's watching. And yet, despite the fact that almost every single person, at least in Britain and probably I'd say the English-speaking world, is aware of 1984 and the book's main concepts, Room 101, Big Brother, and doublespeak. If you explain it to them, they definitely know what you're talking about. And yet, look at the way things have gone. Look at the way things are going. We seem to have done nothing about it. Because it seems to work. It's a strategy that seems to work. And George Orwell, responding to the times in which he lived, but also ahead of the time in which he lived, because he's describing the time in which we live. And it's just kind of frightening.